everyone, and welcome back to our community. If you are new, I'm Jen. I focus on all things self-care, productivity, and wellness while living in New York City. But today, I'm going to tell you everything that I wish I had known before starting a podcast. So if you want the fundamentals, the basics, the first few steps to do when you want to start a podcast, definitely go check out my other video of how to start a podcast. I will link it down below in the description. But in this video, I'm going to share with you everything that I wish I had known before starting a podcast and everything that these big famous podcasters don't tell you. So stick around and let's get right into it. So something that really helped me, and I'm so glad I did it, but that I know so many other people don't know to do, is pre-record before you start a podcast. You want to pre-record a bunch of episodes so that in the meantime, you have time to learn how to edit them, fix any audio issues that you might be having, get comfortable interviewing, have a little bit of buffer room if you don't even want to upload those episodes, but it was good practice. So for me, I actually pre-recorded 4 interviews, and then I also had an intro episode just about me, which we will get into. So I had about a month of prep time. So I recorded an episode about once a week for a month, and the other days of the week I was able to use to create promotion graphics so that every week when I uploaded an episode, I had templates to promote the episode on Instagram, and I got to work out the kinks with audio. I got to play around with my editing style. I got to create an intro jingle, find the music I wanted to use for my intro. An outro I even recorded, all of these things to really make it a great produced podcast. You have time to produce the actual show, create the marketing graphics. There's so much that goes into it beyond just the recording and the uploading that you want to have time to really figure all of that out so it's not a mad rush every single week and it feels messy and hectic. Give yourself time. So essentially plan ahead, but I also believe in the idea of just launch and adjust later. So I'm just talking about having a few episodes in the bank for logistical reasons. Whenever you're starting a new venture, things just naturally take longer. So you don't need the added stress of rushing to get episodes up, rushing to find a guest for your next week's episode, the rush of a guest canceling on you, and then having to reschedule and find someone within that week. Don't give yourself that added stress in your first month because everything is going to take you longer. Editing is going to take you longer. Graphics are going to take you longer. Scheduling is going to take you longer. It's all going to take you longer. So give yourself a month to just be creating the content. Okay, this next tip is, I think, maybe the best tip here that literally no one tells you about. So if you know what a hosting website is, and if you don't, I talk a lot more about it in my fundamentals to podcasting that I was talking about, that video. Again, it'll be down below. But a hosting site is essentially where you get to upload all of your episodes and then it distributes it for you. So it'll distribute it to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, everywhere you can listen to podcasts. You just upload the episode once onto this platform and it'll do it all for you. So typically you will be able to upload it whenever you want, and if you want it to be scheduled for the next day, it'll go up the next day. If you want it to go up right when you upload it, it will, and it'll go up on iTunes, Spotify, all of the platforms. However, for your first episode ever, it will take a minute to get onto Apple Podcasts. So the other platforms, Spotify, they typically will post within, a few hours for your first episode, but for Apple Podcasts, it can take anywhere from a day to 2 weeks to get that first episode on Apple Podcasts. After that, you'll have no problem. It'll go up whenever you want. But for some reason, no one tells you this, and it takes a long time to get your first episode up. So I have a solution. Essentially what happened was, so my first episode that I ever recorded was with the ladies of the OK Sis podcast, which is a huge podcast. They are amazing, and I became friends with them. They became mentors for me, and they had worked with me here. They gave me this tip after I had already, I made my Dare to Self-Care, that's my podcast. I had made the Instagram for it already, and I posted this whole graphic that said, January 11th, my first episode will be everywhere you can listen to podcasts. And they were like, you don't want to do that because when you make a graphic and you make this whole big scene about uploading your first episode and they go to listen to it on Apple Podcasts, chances are it won't be there, and it's kind of like a really bad foot to start off on. So what I did, since I had already posted that graphic a few weeks before January 11th, was I created an intro episode. You can go look at it on my podcast. I'll show it to you right here as I speak to you about it. It's almost like a trailer, if you will. I just created an intro about me, about this podcast episode, and I uploaded it. I did this without promoting it anywhere so that I gave Apple Podcasts the time it needed to get that first episode up. And then about a week or two later, when I finally uploaded my first official episode, I announced it on January 11th. Everyone could go on there because it uploaded quickly, and you go on there, you could listen to my intro and my first episode. So if anything, just more content for everyone. And it actually happens to be one of my most listened to episodes because I think when people find me through my guests, they then go to my intro episode to learn a bit more about me. So it's a great idea in general, but it's also a great idea to combat the issue of Apple Podcasts on the first upload. So it actually only took me about 1 to 2 days to get on Apple Podcasts, not as long as I had assumed, but that's another day or two after I would have had to announce my episode, and it would have been just a mess. So upload an intro episode before you ever launch, just to make sure that you are all set on all platforms and you don't even have to promote it anywhere. Okay, the next thing I wish I knew was to seed out my guests. So if you are an interview-based podcast or even just like a podcast where you have guests on, you can get super eager at first to have any guest on that wants to be on and not really think about the fact that they might not be conversational, they might not vibe with you well or mesh with you well, and that makes for a really awful podcast episode. We're all gonna go through it. It's gonna happen to all of us. People edit their content a lot where they can make themselves sound like great speakers, but they're actually not, and they're not that conversational, so it's gonna happen, but this is my little trick. So I always look at people's IGTVs, their Instagram stories. I go to hear if they were on any others podcasts, things like that, just to get a feel for how they speak, if they're conversational, also how their voice is. I've had someone on before who has terrible vocal fry, which is when they talk like this. And I was literally recording with them like, oh my God, everyone's gonna click out of this. I can barely listen to this. When you're just having an audio only situation, vocals are really important, and it's really important. It's a 1 hour conversation, 30 minutes to an hour. So you want them to be a really engaging person, not just someone who gives you 3-word answers and on to the next. You want them to really be able to converse with you. So that's just my little pro tip. Really seed them out just to make for a really engaging, great, vocally episode, to save you the stress of not wanting to upload the episode and then it's awkward. Should I upload it? Should I not? Is this gonna be weird for a relationship now? Just seed them out. Okay, this next one really varies by person, and it's definitely personal preference, but to save you any added stress, any annoying back and forth emails, if you're gonna be prepping for your podcast anyway, whether it's bullet points of topics or questions, always send them to a guest, because a lot of them have PR representatives who are doing and coordinating their schedule for them, and they want to be able to send their client a list of questions or a list of topics. I've actually been canceled on before, not canceled, but I've had to reschedule before because they were like, sorry, my client requires 3 days in advance to receive the questions and it's 2 days before, so we're gonna have to reschedule. And just to save yourself from all of that, I prep anyway. I make myself a list of questions. I try not to follow them, which is another topic in itself. I try not to like stare at the outline, but it's just for me to do my own research and think about topics that I think would be interesting for the podcast. If I'm doing that research on my own anyway, I just always send it to them just to save the back and forth. You don't want to get on the recording and then they're like, hi, you didn't send me questions. Like, just avoid any of that. Some people don't like to send questions because they don't want people to feel super scripted, but that all goes back to seeding out your guests, making sure they're supernatural, organic, someone you would vibe with. And if you are someone who's gonna vibe with them, they're gonna become very conversational and it won't be very Q&A style. So as long as you vibe well together, I wouldn't worry about anyone feeling too scripted. But yeah, if you're better off the cuff too and you don't really want a list of questions and you don't want to send them a list of questions, even just topics, anything just so that they feel secure and prepared, ready to talk about the topics you want to talk about, and you can avoid any annoying questions or publicists. And I can say that because I am a publicist. So that brings me to my next tip, which is an interview tip. So try not to do Q&A style. Now, obviously, if this is an interview podcast, I'm not saying do not ask questions. Of course you should ask questions, but when you have your guest answering your question, really listen. Relate it back to yourself. Ask a follow-up question that you didn't necessarily plan on. Something I do is I'm like, okay, I'm not recording right now. I'm at a coffee shop with this person and I'm so curious about them. I'm gonna ask them so many questions, but we're at a coffee shop hanging out. So I can still ask those really thoughtful questions in a super engaging way. I've actually taken a hosting class before I ever knew I was gonna get into podcasting, and that was the main tip they had in terms of interviewing. Stop just like listening to their answer while thinking about your next question. It's very obvious when you're thinking about the next question and then you just jump to the next one after you hear their answer. Instead, really listen and give thoughtful response, thoughtful reply, genuine curiosity, relate it back to yourself, like however you would in a network meeting or in a coffee shop meeting. That's how it should be. And think about your favorite podcast. You love when the host feels super engaged and asks a follow-up question that you were probably thinking about as well. You don't want to miss anything that the listener might be like really intrigued by what that person just said, and you didn't ask them more about that because you were so focused on the next question. All right, the next thing that you need to know is a scheduling tip. When I first started, I was doing a lot of back and forth. Are you free this day? Are you free this time? To the point where I lost out on a lot of interviews because people just got sick of answering the emails, sick of things not working out, and it just fell through the cracks. So the most seamless way to do this for both you and the guest is an app or a website called Calendly. Sure, you've heard of it, maybe you haven't, but it basically streamlines everything, and it also does organization for you. So essentially, you plug in on your end all of the times you're available, and you literally put in like, this is a 30-minute recording or a 1-hour recording, and you tell Calendly, I'm available from 1 to 5 on Tuesdays, but do not book these meetings back to back. Please save a half hour in between. So it will automatically, if someone books out your 1 to 2 p.m. slot, someone else cannot book 2 to 3. It will automatically go to 3 to 4 if you said you needed an hour in between. So first of all, it saves you the headache of actually scheduling because you send your schedule to people, they click on when is available for them, and then once they do that, it automatically sends you both a calendar invite. So you don't even have to send them one. It goes straight on your calendar, it goes on theirs, and anything that you want in there can always be there. So there's like a template. So for me, I always have like some tips, like please use Google Chrome, please use an external microphone if you have one, things like that. And then I also have a little question portion. So the first question I ask is, are there any topics you would love to speak to? And the second one I ask is, are you comfortable doing an Instagram takeover on the Dare to Self-Care Pod Instagram? I ask that second one because it saves the awkward encounter of asking them and them saying no. If they want to say no, they can just answer it in your little calendar link. And the purpose of that is so that they can take over your Instagram. You're creating more value on your Instagram account. People can ask follow-up questions in their Q&A, and also it brings their community members over to your podcast Instagram and your podcast, therefore, as a listener, because they will probably post on there saying, hey, I'm taking over the Dare to Self-Care podcast Instagram. Come on over if you want to ask a question or have me take you through a day of my life, whatever it is. So it is super great marketing tool, and just to avoid that awkward encounter, I just include it in the calendar invite. Also, I forget to ask sometimes, so topic, are you open to the Instagram takeover, the Zencastr link, and everything in there. So I just wish I knew this before going back and forth for so many months with scheduling, will you take over my Instagram, all that kind of stuff. Just use Calendly. For one event, it's free, so if you're just using it for your podcast recordings, it's totally free. If you want to also use it for networking meetings or whatever else, I think you have to pay extra for like additional events, but if you're just doing the one event podcast recordings, it's totally free, which is what I do. Okay, lastly, this was my main question when I first started, so I wanted to be able to give you guys my final conclusion on it after asking amazing podcasters, Maddie and Scout of OK Sis, Natalie Barbu from The Real Real. I really asked around for people's opinions and formed a conclusion that everyone seems to agree on, and that's to the question, should I post my interviews on YouTube? So if you go back in my channel here, I did post 1 or 2. So I initially planned on always posting them here. I don't know why. I quickly realized, oh my God, this is gonna take over my whole channel. I was like, should I start a new one that's just Dare to Self-Care on YouTube? I didn't really know what to do, if it was worth all the extra work, because it's a whole entire video. You're kind of more aware of your setup when it comes to the podcast recording, where now that I only do audio, I'm like sitting on my couch lounging in sweats, and it doesn't matter what the lighting looks like. But it's a lot of work. If your podcast is the only thing you're doing content-wise and you have the time, it really can't hurt. At the end of the day, that's the conclusion, is that it can't hurt to put your episodes on YouTube. However, if you're questioning it, if you're like, oh, I don't really want to, but is it gonna make that big of a difference? The answer is no. And the reason I say that is, if you're doing just virtual recordings, no one cares to watch a Zoom interview on YouTube. It was not worth the work for me to be uploading a Zoom interview on YouTube. That's the bottom line. However, if you think about it, what podcasts do you watch on YouTube? Pretty Basic, Wild Till 9, Nick Vial, anyone who has a full-on like studio setup where it feels like a talk show, they're all in person, there's like a whole, you know, logo behind them and a whole setup, that I'll watch because that's a talk show. Same with The Morning Toast. The Morning Toast does not feel like a podcast to me, it feels like a talk show. I always watch it on YouTube. But if it's a Zoom interview, I have no interest on watching it on YouTube. So that's my conclusion. It's not worth it if you're just doing virtual interviews. If you are trying to really blow up your podcast and you want to invest money into it and the podcast is the end game, maybe rent out a studio. That's like really leveling up. But to do, you know, and be successful on YouTube, I think it needs to be more like a talk show setup. So if you don't have the time or you don't have the resources to, you know, produce a quality video, it's not worth it. Okay, so those are all the things that I wish I knew before starting a podcast and what podcasters do not tell you. Comment down below if you guys have a podcast or want to start a podcast. I would love to hear more about your idea or listen to your podcast if it's already live. Let me know what you guys wish you knew before starting a podcast. Don't forget to subscribe so that we can keep hanging out. Give this video a thumbs up if it was helpful for you, and click the notification bell so that you never miss a video because I love hanging out with you guys. And I will see you guys next week. Mwah.